Uh, so today we're going to continue with Thomas Aquinas. Um, and I just thought of some important thing to say about him, which I don't remember. Every time I may have said this and may not, but every time I go through these guys, I think of more stuff to say about them, or I find some new insight or some new criticism or something like that. So it's really it never oddly enough gets old. There's an old story about Steve Cropper, who was the guitar player in Booker T and the NGs and famous producer and everything. And he used to do the Phil Spector records and or some of them. He was a session man on some of the Phil Spector records. And Phil Spector was famous for doing a million takes of everything. And all the musicians would get sick of going over and over and over the same song. And they asked Cropper about it. And he said, by the way, he was a guitar player in the Blues Brothers, if that makes any reference, or if that's a reference for you. Anyway, Cropper said, no, every time I play it, I get deeper into it. I find better nuances and more subtle things, and I'm further into the pocket. So I don't mind it at all. I'm kind of like that about music and a philosophy, although I'm done with playing music. Anyway, Thomas Aquinas. Well, today what I excuse me, what I want to talk about is his influence on Catholic moral teaching, specifically his teaching about sexuality, because um, it is so influential on Catholic thinking today and conservative Christian thinking today that I think it's worth our time to go through how he developed it. Now, it has to be said, I wrote something that I thought was rather humorous about this. Not all societies are so puritanical about sexuality as most religions are, but not all religions, and specifically not what we call primitive religions, like the religions of some Native Americans and some Polynesians are not at all puritanical about it, but for some reason the Abrahamic religions and some parts of Hinduism, some parts of Buddhism are very strict with regard to sexuality, puritanical. And there's not a huge amount of biblical. There is some. The biblical texts, and I can quote them to you. I think I did maybe before. They're not that specific about, but mostly it has to do with adultery and homosexuality. There are rules in Leviticus and there are rules in the New Testament kind of about adultery, but they don't get as far into the weeds as Thomas did. Well, he didn't get into the weeds. He's very careful about his language. We don't want to do anything salacious on this broadcast or uh, beyond R rated. Even R rated is a little bit pushing it, but um, it is a weird thing. I mean, I don't know what to make of it actually. It's too broad of a category to me for me to have anything intelligent to say about it, but it doesn't seem like it, you know, like when we talked about misogyny, it may have to do with male dominance or male power or something. I don't know. I can't really explain why it is, but there are matriarchal societies, and I actually don't know. You'd have to have an anthropologist tell us whether matriarchal societies tend to be as puritanical. Uh, I have no idea. That's an interesting question, I guess. But anyway, as we know, the Catholic Church is very strict against abortion. I'll lay it out for you in a minute. And this comes primarily from the thinking of Thomas Aquinas down through the ages until the most recent edition of canon law was revised in 1983. So that's pretty recent considering Christianity's been around a couple of thousand years. And so that's the most recent revision that I know about. I think that's up to date. And the point is that it's based on, well, he thinks, Thomas and the Catholic Church thinks it's based on natural law. Well, what is natural law? Everybody thinks that whatever they do is natural because they do it. And most religions teach that what they do is consistent with the laws of the universe. We saw that with the Greeks, Moira or Ananke or Dike. These are all the laws of the universe that are embedded in reality. And we do our best to comport ourselves in a way that's consistent with what the laws of the universe are. And even with the Greeks, even the gods have to obey these laws. Now, we ran into difficulty with that in the Euthyphro, if you remember, where the question was, does God have to obey laws or not? Or does he just make them up by whatever he says is law? And we didn't find a good answer for that, and I don't have one either. But Socrates didn't in the Euthyphro. That was the question he raised. Uh, but certainly the Christians want to say that what they are teaching is consistent with the rules of uh, of natural law, which come from God. And I'm going to give you a couple of quotes here about this. Let me see. Uh, all right. Let me just read a little bit from Thomas Aquinas himself. Um, Says it's not possible that man's ultimate happiness consists in contemplation based on the understanding of first principles, for this is most imperfect as being most universal, containing potentially the knowledge of things. What he's saying there is that what he's going to say is your ultimate happiness has to be in understanding or contemplating the beatific vision of God, which is beyond human comprehension. Anyway, moreover, it's the beginning and not the end of human inquiry, and comes to us from nature and not through the pursuit of the truth. The truth is going to be beyond nature. Nor does it consist in contemplation based on the sciences that have the lowest things for their object, the lowest things, I guess, reality. Since happiness must consist in an operation of the intellect in relation to the most noble intelligible objects, it follows then that man's ultimate happiness consists of wisdom based on the consideration of divine things. It is therefore evident also by way of induction that man's ultimate happiness consists solely in the contemplation of God, which conclusion was proved by the above arguments. This is follows from Aristotle's idea of purpose or telos. In other words, the ultimate end of man is contemplation, and the ultimate kind of contemplation is the contemplation of God. Um, the Middle Ages or Thomas made a distinction between via contemplativa and via activa. In other words, the life of action and the life of contemplation. And of the two, the life of contemplation was supposed to be the more pure and untarnished. And of course, that's what monks are supposed to do. Thomas Aquinas was famously a big fat monk. There, I have a cartoon of him. So I don't know if this is true, but I can't believe this is true. But supposedly at the dining hall or the refectory in the monastery where he was, a notch had to be cut out of the table for his stomach. That's by legend. I can't believe that's true because it really doesn't get you any closer, right, to the plate. All right. He says, he thus implies that the light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing else than the imprint on us of the divine light. It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the natural, rational creature's participation in the eternal law. And another quote from Thomas that kind of echoes this, is the natural law is the divine or the eternal law of God written in the hearts of men. Now, this is Thomas's explanation for what we found in Plato, which is recollection of what's good and wrong. We get that from recollection, according to Plato. According to Thomas, we get it from the imprint, is the word he uses, of God's eternal law on the hearts of men, right? So that's that. Having said that, the law is not, is susceptible to his interpretation based on what he perceives to be the good of man or the purpose of man. And this is, he comes by through observation to a degree. Remember the distinction Thomas made between, he didn't use this term, but between natural law and natural religion or revealed religion. Yeah, Meredith.
What you told us last week was that Thomas Aquinas preached that women are defective, and so therefore they're only good to be servile to men. I guess to do chores and have babies. But for good order, women are naturally subject to men. And I think that doesn't this come about in some degree because men found women distracting? I mean, they were trying to contemplate God. And certainly in Eastern religions, women have to go around with, I'm in Mohammedanism, women have to go around with body and face coverings. All you get to see is their eyes, because if you can see an ankle, then that's going to distract men from their proper duty, which is to contemplate God, right? So women,
All of the above is true, Meredith. And I thought hard and long about introducing this subject for the same reason I was worried about introducing misogyny, because we can spin off the rails and talk about this forever without any relationship to Thomas Aquinas. And so everything you said was correct, but I don't want to just have a discussion about, men and women or that kind of thing, because it's nothing that I know any more about than you do. So the only thing I can help you with is a text that I do know about. And
well, so what you're saying is that for those of us who are the women in your class, this doesn't apply to us. We
what?
have no
No,
we have
it's
no obligation to contemplate goodness.
that's not true. That's none of that is true.
Of
This
course it
this is
is.
what I'm describing to you is um, the texts that have influenced the society you live in. It's not like, and I would say that if you want to understand the society you live in, you'd do well to understand the bricks that constructed it. I'm not giving any disapproval or approval to women's participation in this discussion. For heaven's sakes, that would be ridiculous. Uh, Not at all. Peter,
Um, I assume that Thomas believed that women also had as the highest end of their lives the contemplation of the beatific vision, even if he simultaneously assumed that they were less good at it, as a general rule. Dante does not make that assumption. But to
that's
support what Meredith said, this is irrelevant, but it's quick. Saint Jerome was recently referred to in an article by Aaron McGlack as believing that women's bodies were just plain disgusting. And I looked Jerome up in Peter Brown's book, The Body and Society, and he had an experience that many desert hermits had. He was a desert hermit for a couple of years, I think, in Palestine. He said often when he was spending all his time fasting and praying, he would find himself in imagination surrounded by bands of dancing girls. You know?
heavens, heavens, heavens. Uh, no, I listen. We could we if we want to have an interesting discussion about men and women and their relative powers, we could do no better than switching on YouTube or TikTok, and we'll have a jolly day of it. But I'm just going to talk about the guys I know about, and just forgive me for that. But I can't. But I will answer one point. I feel the same way, Meredith, but we can't prove that. That, in other words, that men were kind of afraid of the power of women and they wanted to control it some way. It seems very true in Augustine that that's the case because, you know, as I mentioned, he seemed like an alcoholic that was addicted to women, but then when he became celibate, he had to write about how you had to be celibate. You know, anyway, all these things have obvious echoes and manifestations in all of our lives. But I just want to keep us on the program here of learning the things that I have some knowledge of, not and the relationship between women and men is not among them. I do not claim any expertise in that area. Although I've met women, I know them. My wife is a woman, as it turns out. So it's not like a completely alien subject to me, but to claim that I can be instructive in this matter is um, a little bit wild. Okay. Uh, the I want to give you the uh, Thomas's classification of sexual sins, and this is from the Summa, question 154. He lists six kinds of. The main thing that main point I want to make it simple, is that his main concern is any kind of sex that is not intended or couldn't potentially result in a birth, right? So his sins of lust, ordered from worst to, I mean, most severe to least, are masturbation, bestiality, homosexuality, and vitiation of the marital act. And I think this means anything but the missionary position. Then continuing incest, rape, and adultery, and seduction of a virgin, and simple fornication. That means sex outside of marriage. So those are in order of severity, according to Thomas. And I don't know how you feel about that list. I probably would move rape up a couple of notches anyway. But in any case, that's Thomas's list. And again, the guiding principle for Thomas is, remember the idea of telos, or purpose. So the purpose of sexuality is reproduction. And so if you're doing anything that's not intended to result in reproduction, then you're doing something sinful and lustful. And I'm not sure why. It really does say that. I mean, he says it in very prudish terms, but the missionary position is the only one acceptable. Anything else is lustful. Uh, and then any other kind of sexual act, other than normal sex in the missionary position, is prohibited, according to, or lustful or sinful, according to Thomas. Uh, what are they? Vanilla sex, I think, is what the word is today. Um, all right. So then the question arose to me, well, what about if your wife is pregnant? There's a bunch of questions. There's, I mean, listen, I think I get some kind of award of valor for spending the morning trying to figure out canon law and sexuality. I really need a shot of heroin after that. But anyway, uh, the um, the question arises: what if your wife is pregnant? That's not going to result in a new pregnancy. So can you have sex? Well, the Catholic Church fudges on this and says, yeah, sure, fine. And the other thing, though, that I find very peculiar, I love stuff like this when you run into something that just doesn't make any sense. Human beings, human females, have what's called concealed ovulation or cryptic ovulation. What that means is neither the male nor the female knows that the woman is fertile. That's very unusual with animals. In most animals, either by scent or by some visual signal, the female gives a signal that she is ready to accept mating, and this could result in a pregnancy, right? And this is also true of bonobos and chimpanzees, our closest relatives. Um, why is the pregnancy of or the fertility of a woman, the ovulation of a woman, hidden from us? And whose idea was that? Well, it was God's idea, right? God made the sexes the way He made them, and He made it so that neither male nor female could tell when she was potentially going to get pregnant. Now, why that? And then say any sexual act that is not intended to result in a pregnancy is sinful. Uh, I don't know. Maybe it all makes sense. Okay, Catherine, unmute yourself and then go for it.
That, well, that gives the man the right to have sex all month long. He never knows. So it's giving man the power again.
Along the same lines, though, is that females are receptive to sex. That's not true in all animals. Females will not be receptive to sex when they're not ovulating in many species. That's not true of bonobos, who are our close, very close relative. Chimps and bonobos are the most closely related to human beings. Bonobos will have sex for any reason, anytime. They use it for, negotiation and stuff. They're the worst sluts that there are. But human females are not as bad as bonobos, if I may use the word bad. They're not as promiscuous as bonobos. But and then chimpanzees, on the other hand, chimpanzees usually the females want to have sex with the dominant male. So that's a little different from both bonobos and human beings. Anyway, so God makes this system where, uh, you don't know when the female's going to get pregnant, but you shouldn't be having sex when she's not going to get pregnant. Dennis, Doug, I mean.
two two thoughts. One, I didn't hear pederasty on that list, which
Uh, it
I it's
it it
given
is
it's
something like,
a
well,
Catholic priest, I don't know, what the deal is.
actually there is something about that, but go ahead.
Number two, one of the few areas that women really do have power over men is through sex.
Yeah, what's that play, the Greek play? Um,
Lysistrata.
Yeah.
Lysistrata, right?
Yeah.
Uh, it's I must say it's weird for me. We're just going to get in all kinds of personal anecdotes, and who wants that? But women always seem to hold the hammer as far as I'm concerned. But what do I know? I mean,
Yeah.
they're the ones that can say no. And okay, so I'm already in trouble. And shaking her head.
Yeah,
It
well,
depends. It depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about a marital relationship, I don't know. I've never been in a relationship with any woman that I wasn't in some measure afraid of. So uh, there, that's a different situation in the workplace and sports and anything else, politics, finance, whatever. But in marital relationship, but I really don't want to get involved in that, because we're all just gonna we're all gonna have something interesting to say, but we're not here to be interesting. We're here to be educated. Uh, let's see. Dennis, to your point, let me see if I can find the passage for you about that. I kind of doubt it, but because I've just got so many notes here. Do-do. Well, talk amongst yourselves for a minute. I'll get this done. No? Here we go.
Anne had something else to say. Can you let her say it? Tony?
Yeah,
I was-
Ann,
Let
sure,
Anne
Ann. Yeah,
say.
speak
yeah,
up, Ann.
I was just going to make the obvious point that there's plenty of cases when the man holds the power and rapes the woman, abuses the woman, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it's and also, never mind. I mean, it's hard to make any kind of, it's hard to make any kind of generalizations
But
about sex.
I think that's a physical dominance, you know?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which
No,
I mean, we all acknowledge that. I mean, there's not, you know.
no,
Right.
but I want to take that one. My wife did a lot of her research in domestic violence, and it's like rape is control. You know, it's to take dominance. It's
Yeah.
by force. It's not it's in fact it's almost not sexual at all. It's
Right.
just yeah, it's very much a control issue.
Right.
And and so on. And
Yeah.
it's
Well, I think sure that men are afraid of women, women are afraid of men. It's too bad. I'll tell you, since you're looking up something, I'll tell you guys an anecdote. Long ago, I taught at Scripps, and I love Whitman's poem Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Walking, where he describes walking on the beach at night,
Rocking.
endlessly rocking. And he describes walking on the beach at night and having this ecstatic vision of his role as a poet and the nature of the universe and so on. And I taught it to my women students at Scripps, and they said, "Oh my God, we would never walk on the beach alone at night." And I'm like, oh Lord, what does that say about how women go through their lives being afraid? And
Yeah,
they're,
well, they just, I'm sure you just uh, heard this poll where most women would rather be in alone in the woods with a bear than with a man.
Jesus.
What I want to know now, Thomas Aquinas, there must be a reason that he's venerated and that we're studying him. And it obviously isn't what he thinks about women. That is not, we're not going to be receptive to his thoughts about women being defective. So what thoughts did he have that are important for us to know about?
Well, you're saying that's not important. There's a billion Catholics in the world that abide by the rules of the Catholic Church. So it may not be important to you, but it is important for us to know about society having this influence. Now, you may not think he's worth knowing about, but that's not really the issue. It's whether he's an important figure in our intellectual history.
So let's talk about that.
yeah. I want to go back to because there's that source issue, the natural law, and sort of his imagination about why these things are what they are. And then that he could bring down to the level of saying, by God, I got rules, right? Because that's what's going on. He has a theoretical construct, then he comes down and says, oh, and here's the 6 levels of sin about sex,
Hmm.
which is really bringing it down from the theoretical to the, you know, now I got a bunch of rules for you.
Right. I don't see how the rules aren't just arbitrary. And there is this, but as I go back to the point I made at the very beginning, I'm not even sure why religion has to concern itself with the private lives of individuals unless it's about power. Most organized religion is in one way or another about power. And, I made the point way back in the Greeks about how the idea of having a lot of gods led itself to a liberal society where you have a democracy. Now, I'm not going to stand by that, like I know what I'm talking about, because I don't have a scientific way of evidencing that. But in a monotheistic culture, you have a set of rules that everybody abides by. And it's easier to formulate a legal system where everything is consistent. And Thomas is nothing else if not consistent. He's incomprehensible and full of fallacies, but he's uh, he's the most consistent of all the Western philosophers in terms of presenting a system that has the same kind of thinking throughout. Let's put it that way. But that doesn't mean he's right. And so Meredith, I'm not trying to defend Thomas for being right or anything like that. I'm just I'm a teacher. I'm just doing this like you would study, Byzantine art. this is what they did. I'm not saying it's good or bad or I approve of it. Peter.
One thing to remember is that St. Thomas Aquinas didn't make up all these rules out of his own head. He was dealing with a long church tradition of what you could and couldn't do, what you should and shouldn't do. And the most original thing, it seems to me, I've read very little by him, but the most original thing he did was combine this with the more rational, more methodically empirical approach of Aristotle. It's a little like what Moses Maimonides did in the Jewish religion. There were plenty of Talmudic rules and laws and taboos and prohibitions and all those things. He turned to Aristotle and said, let's look for the universal rules behind these commonly accepted rules, so that neither of them were trying to be all that original, I think.
That's absolutely correct. A couple of things about that. Yeah, he didn't do this in a vacuum. He didn't come out of nowhere and do this. He had the tradition of Tertullian, uh, Augustine, who those were a couple of big figures, and a whole line of thinkers between him and Augustine. And he was answering questions within that tradition. One of the things that I don't like about theology in general is that the answer has to come out in a certain way. That's not how we roll in philosophy. You start asking questions and you don't know how it's going to turn out. But in theology, it always has to come out consistent with the Bible. That's a given. And so what Thomas is doing is trying to, again, the word apology means explanation. Why does this not, or how can we make this make sense? So that's what he's doing. Now, to get back to whether it makes sense or not, I want to return to the idea of his idea that the worst sins are the ones that are committed because you want to have sex through lust, but not through a desire to procreate, right? The ones that he thinks are the worst are the ones that could not possibly end in procreation. But what I want to say is, well, define procreation, and I want to get back to the idea of uh, uh, concealed female ovulation and what's called extended uh, sexuality in females. Both of those are terms in that field. Um, so you want to ask yourself, why are we unique in that way, or very strange in that way compared to most mammals? And the theory, the most nobody knows for sure, but the theory that is most common is that this promotes the fact that the female and male do not know whether she can become pregnant means that the male has to stick around all the time and the female has to stick around all the time. And this is related to something called the attritional nature of the human child. Now, you guys who are bird watchers will be familiar with the term precocial as opposed to altricial. Precocial means like ducks. Ducks are right away, they can swim and follow their mom into the water. Altricial birds are born blind without feathers and they're completely helpless. With regard to human babies, they are more altricial than our close relatives, the bonobos and the chimpanzees. In other words, the offspring can readily kind of, I wouldn't say it can exist without its parents, but it doesn't. Part of this is you'll probably know that the birth canal is too small to admit the passage of a fully developed human brain. So the brain isn't developed when the child is born, and it has to develop outside the womb. This means the child is helpless for a more extended period of time than is the case with chimpanzees and bonobos. So what that means is one of the parents has to be finding food, and if you only have one parent, the likelihood of the child being raised to adulthood is much, much smaller. So now in our society, that's not the case because we all have all kinds of a social network to hopefully. When I say our society, I mean, relatively modern society. It's not like, but anyway, the idea is that the male's attention is necessary, and the bonding between male and female is necessary for a longer period of time in males. And this is one justification that's been made by biologists as to why there is this concealed ovulation. Now, again, this is not doctrine, it's not proven, it's just the most common theory about it. There are other theories too that are all related to evolution as opposed to scripture. Uh, and so, what you want to ask Thomas is, okay, well, wait a second. These sexual acts that aren't intended to produce a child might be necessary for, in the end, the child to become grown and not at much as much of a risk for perishing in the first 2 months because the male is still paying attention to the female. Instead of there being just one period of ovulation, one period of mating, and then the male goes his own way. The child would not survive if that were the case. The male needs to stick around in order to raise the child to adulthood, or just even to a viability. So that's the reason for it. Now, if I apply that to Thomas, I go back, well, this is what God intended. You're talking about natural law. God intended. I'm trying to see if I can persuade Thomas that no, it shouldn't just sexuality shouldn't just be limited to direct reproduction. It should be limited, or it should pertain to the child being raised to viability, which takes two parents, which takes the attention of the male or the bonding of the male and female to achieve it. What do you think of that argument? Nothing at all.
That's the that would be the evolutionary argument.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, to be fair to Thomas, he didn't know about concealed ovulation. He was a monk for one thing. He didn't know anything. Uh, well, I don't know. I don't know what he knew.
Or natural selection or whatever. Yeah.
Right, natural selection would have promoted the bonding of the male and female for a longer period of time, the steady bonding, uh, so that the child will survive. And so it's not just a matter of reproduction. Even if you assume that God has everything that Thomas assumes, that God has created this, it's not just for the actual birth of the child, it's for the raising of the child, because without raising the child to viability, that child's not going to reproduce, and so there's not going to be a human species.
I
So
thought we had
that's
already agreed that the purpose of human beings was to reproduce, and
Well, the purpose of
produce the
sexuality is to,
viability would be even better, I suppose.
no, I'm sorry, say that again. Are you saying that
We
he says that, or
we decided that. I thought a couple of maybe we didn't decide it, but I thought we had
what do you mean we?
decided. Me, I decided. Right?
Do you mean evolution decided that? No, I'm trying.
No, yeah. Well, we were talking about the purpose. I probably Meredith was bringing this up. What's our purpose? But we decided. I decided anyhow. I'm using we hopefully that the purpose was reproduction.
we're assuming from this that we can confidently say that men have the same or a similar or an equal investment in reproduction of their seed, of their descendants, and so you can count on male partners to do some of the work that's required to bring a baby from complete helplessness to, a kid who can scythe wheat or something.
That's a really interesting point because, clearly there are animals. Like, let's just take a red-tailed hawk. The male participates in raising the chicks, but he's not having sex with the female anymore. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on red tails, but I'm just saying there are plenty of animals, and particularly birds, where the male and female raise the babies. where they don't have to have the guarantee of sex in order to attract the male to stick
Those
around
picture.
and bond with the female. But in that's the theory with regard to human beings as opposed to say our close relatives, the bonobos and the chimps. That's all I'm saying is it's a common theory, and I think you're right about the male does make an investment. The male, in some species, the male will kill the babies if the female has a offspring. Like lions do this. If the female has offspring by another male, the another competing male can come in and kill the babies because they're not his. This is another argument. I don't want to just capitalize or uh, commandeer the discussion here, but another theory about why there's uh, a this kind of sexual attraction is that for human males, they can't be certain that they're the father. Whereas other animals can be because they know that other male was scared away. So the female must have been impregnated when the male wasn't around. And so human beings, uh, they keep the male is kept around so that the male can pretty much, I don't know. There's a theory about that is related to the male knowing about whose offspring is who. And I think you were first, and then we got a couple other people.
Oh, well, yeah, but let them have it first because I already talked. So
Okay,
I'll be in line.
Alan, you want to say so, or Alan, you go.
I want to get back to Aquinas a little bit, and one of the things that I notice is that Christianity is based on the teachings of Jesus, and that, as far as I can tell in the Bible, Jesus said almost nothing about sexuality. We
That's
don't.
right.
He never condemned homosexuality. He never condemned sex
That's
out
right.
of marriage. And yet Aquinas is amplifying on Christianity without any reference to what Jesus thought about these things. And I noticed the same thing in Islam, that Muhammad had a much more egalitarian relationship with his wife than is generally allowed in any Muslim country. That the followers come up with these prescriptive, conservative, controlling rules about sex that are not traceable to the founder. And so just like to bring that up.
In regard to your point about Jesus, he did even defend a woman of ill repute, if you remember, in the Bible. And yes, you're right. He doesn't talk about sex directly. That's St. Paul and Leviticus, that kind of stuff. But Thomas was, of course, trying to incorporate the whole tradition. Uh, I don't want to defend it. I'm just saying you're right about that. Jesus didn't say anything about it. Who was, oh, we got Peter. Let me go with Barry. I think he was next. I don't know. Oh, and then Laurel's got her hand up digitally. Laurel, why don't you go? And then we'll get to Barry.
Just a comment on the business about males investment. There biologically, there's a lot of variation in the strategies that are used. Whether you have a small number of children, but really work hard to take care of them, like the red-tailed hawk, if you will, or the eagles that have eagle cams, and the scatter your seed everywhere. So there's an interesting thing in the Bible. If you think about in the Old Testament, if you will, there are um, monogamy is not enforced or entailed. Indeed, there are all the patriarchs with multiple wives and concubines and whatnot. But
Yeah.
by the time we get around to Jesus, there appears to be at least a partial transition to monogamy. I'm not sure exactly what the history on that is, but I think one of the things that Aquinas is pretty clear on is he's totally bought into marriage as between a man and a woman. And although interestingly, he doesn't seem to be, it's not clear to me exactly how much he credits this transition to monogamy as biblical, or as, it's not clear exactly where this comes from in that world. And also it's a little unclear to me to what extent these commands or precepts he has appear to be directed more at men, with the assumption that women, being a wife will, aside from the possibility of fornication, if you will, their conduct is not as prescribed as men. So it seems like his commands are really directed more specifically at men, and he's more concerned about them. And I wonder if that comes also from his living situation, not having been.
That's a very interesting point. But by the way, as far as monogamy concerns, it is one of the Ten Commandments, Although the way they get around that is they, like Abraham impregnates uh what's her name?
Or
Hagar.
Hagar. Sammy Hagar. Abraham impregnates Hagar, and that's not considered a sin. Why? Because she's not another person's wife, I guess. I mean, there's this squirrely stuff about concubines and so forth that they don't count. So adultery with them doesn't count or something. I don't know.
Jacob has
They there's a lot of fudging going on in biblical or any kind of theological writing. I'm sorry, Laurel.
Jacob has multiple wives.
Oh yeah, I mean, so does
So the,
Solomon. Barry,
I
try to
just I
get you
just
in
wanted
here
to
finally.
I wanted to just bring up the notion of pleasure, since all of these prohibitions um, seem to be biased against pleasure. I'm wondering whether Aquinas's and the church's suspicion about pleasure extends beyond sex to other pursuits.
Absolutely. Augustine, remember, was ashamed that he took pleasure in his child. Uh, bright colors, music, dancing, all that stuff was something that detracted your attention away from God. So yes, for sure. It's best. I, I hired for I hate to say this, let me see, my second marriage, I hired a justice of the peace. And one of the things he said during the ceremony was that the married life wasn't as beautiful as the single life. And I went, who the fuck, where'd you get that, man? I mean, this is a marriage. Who's paying you here, dude? Uh, anyway, I was really astonished to hear him say that. But that is the position of St. Paul, by the way, what that justice of the peace said. Um, somebody else had their hand up too, I
Yeah.
I
think.
was just, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so going way back to this concealed ovulation thing, that's only partly true. A lot of women can tell when they're ovulating because they feel different. Namely, they usually feel pretty horny. But the other thing is you divide your cycle in half, and pretty much that's when you're ovulating.
Yeah, it's true, but it's not very bulletproof. It's not like, like baboons where you
Yeah, I
uh
know.
and the Catholic Church, I just read this morning and I don't remember, but the Catholic Church, I think, even considers the rhythm method
Yeah,
contraception, and contraception is not approved. So you can't
exactly.
even do that.
No, I,
No,
I
you
think the
can do the
rhythm
rhythm
method is
method.
allowed, but it
Uh-huh.
doesn't work very well.
I'm gonna look that up because I think this morning I just read that it was considered a form of contraception. But yeah,
In the
because
60s.
the sperm is spilled outside the womb.
Mm,
So
well,
Oh no, that's not the rhythm method.
oh,
Okay,
That's
no,
not the
second
rhythm
not the
method.
that
rhythm. I
that's
was
a different form of contraception.
I was just going to
Sorry.
quickly about Jesus and sex.
Yeah.
The celebration of the marriage at Cana of Galilee shows a desire or a willingness to celebrate marriage. And what he says to the woman taken in adultery shows a pretty traditional view of adultery when he says, go and sin no more. What's radical is that instead of taking part in stoning her to death, he turns on the crowd and says, "He that is without sin, let him cast the first stone," which goes way beyond a plea for mercy. It's basically saying
He has
nobody has
other
the right to do this.
also the log
Yeah.
in your eye. Dennis. I mean, I keep saying Dennis. Doug.
You can just call me Julia. We'll leave
Julia.
it.
Yeah, Julia is more comfortable.
Back to Alan's comment, which I think is really, for me, is really critical to the whole thing, is by what authority is our Augustine or uh, Augustine or Aquinas, by what authority do they have this power to impose these, these philosophical things on the church? I mean, by
Are you asking?
power.
Are you asking
It's
legally within the?
Well, maybe I'm not being clear about it, but it seems like if Christianity is based, as Alan pointed out, on the teachings or the actions of Christ, how do these subsequent philosophers, theologians, etc., how are they empowered?
Okay, that's an excellent question. The in the Protestant Church, they are not. So this is specifically to Catholics and canon law. And canon law isn't specifically based on Thomas, but he's heavily influential. He was, in the 13th century, he became a very influential, the most influential figure in Catholic interpretation. So these guys were all interpreting the Bible, from Tertullian to Augustine to, you know, Karl Barth. Well, Karl Barth's a Protestant. Karl Rahner is, I think, 20th century Catholic theologian. All these guys are trying to interpret the Bible, and I imagine if you were a Catholic priest, you could defend yourself pretty well for whatever you did by referring to Thomas Aquinas directly. But canon law, like I say, most recently revived in 1983, is heavily based and sometimes exactly quotes and refers to Thomas Aquinas. He's called the angelic doctor. He just has a tremendous amount of status within the tradition of Catholicism. And beyond that, I'm not sure what I could tell you. He wasn't a pope, and so he didn't have that kind of authority. He just was a thinker that, in the Catholic tradition, is heavily referred to and admired. And once again, I just, uh, Meredith, I'm not, this isn't stuff that I think is right. It's stuff that has informed and created the tradition that we live in right now. And so I think it's worth knowing just from that standpoint how these things came to be accepted ideas.
Well, Tony, why does everybody look up to him? And all we've talked about is his attitude toward women.
And his proofs for the existence of God.
Oh,
I don't
and
think
his proofs
everybody
for the
does.
existence of God.
I don't think
I'm
everybody
sorry.
does. I don't. I mean, what do you mean everybody? The people in the Catholic Church do, because that's part of their theology and their belief. When you sign in, you're either on the bus or off the bus. So if you sign up as a Catholic, then the interpretation of God is mediated through the teachings of the Catholic Church, which are heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas. So when you
So
say everybody, I'm not one of those people, but there are a billion of them on the planet.
when you say that canon law is based widely on what Aquinas wrote, I assume that he wrote more widely than just about proofs for the existence of God and
Oh yeah,
sexual sins. Can
he
you
wrote on
give an
everything.
outline? Can you give us a really 10,000-foot
Oh my
sense of
God.
how
He
widely
wrote
he wrote?
he wrote on every question you could think of, basically. I mean, the Summa Theologica and the Summa Gentilis and De Veritate are tremendous works. In fact, once it occurred to me that just writing down those words, even if you didn't have to do any of the thinking, would take a lifetime. It's so much doctrine and thinking put into these huge tomes. So I don't think I could begin. I would put it this way. If there's a question you have about religion, he wrote on it. It's just about everything you can imagine. He wrote on it. Gerald, you got your hand up?
Yeah. It's there's something I missed, but it seems to me that what Aquinas did was he just picked up the cultural standards of his time and declared those to be natural law. Was there any other thought process there?
Well, I think it went a little bit beyond that. He was raised in it, or he. In fact, I think if I remember correctly, his parents didn't want him to go into the minister or to to be a monk. They didn't want that, but he decided to do that. He was a tremendously avid student, and he studied all of the theologians before him. I don't think it's just the culture of his day. He was an academic. What's the word? Uh, anyway, he was a very acute and astute student of the theology that went before him. In other words, he would have memorized the Bible, read everything by Augustine 10 times. Just he was a very uh, scholarly person. And what he tried to do was interpret all of these things he'd read before and then insert the thinking of Aristotle in. And in his mind, I think he thought he was bolstering the teachings of the church and trying to show, hey, this isn't just a bunch of weird things that we believe. They are supported by hard reasoning and the reasoning of a pagan to boot. So I think that, what uh, his success is not whether you agree with him or not, his success is not like a random thing. He isn't just some random guy that got picked out of the tradition that people admire. He was a tremendous intellect. Uh, Agree with him or not, he was
Mhm.
tremendously studious and prolific. So his influence is not just kind of a random thing, I should say, if that answers your question. As far as Doug goes, I guess it was Doug that said, "Can you give us a general view?" The only thing I can say is what he's famous for is that melding of pagan, the Aristotelian view and the biblical view, or the theological view. That would be his
Yeah.
main claim to fame, but that covers a huge amount of territory.
So when we use the foundation of natural law, that's sort of harking back to Aristotle, sort of seeing the world or sort of taking into all those accounts and melding that with the Catholic tradition that he came to. Right. So as you said, he didn't start from scratch. Some of these rules are existed. So they had to be um, melded in or reconciled with what his sort of the use of logic and the observation into a coherence. I mean, it's like, is that kind of where we're getting? Because I'm trying to understand how they use, because natural law has no boundaries. So he has to have a way of thinking about it logically.
Well, do you remember what Augustine said? Believe so you can understand. And then my point that I just made about uh, all arguments in the end have to be consistent with biblical teachings. So he was very good at manipulating ideas, I would say. I mean, to me, if I read Aquinas, it's just a bunch of word salad. There's a bunch of undefined terms in there that he just spews out randomly, and natural law would be one of them. Just the definition of natural law as the eternal law of God written in the hearts of men. What the hell does that mean? I have no idea what that means. But he thinks it means something. And there's just volumes of this kind of talk that most of which means nothing to me, but it means a lot to a billion people on the planet. Uh, so that's our justification. It's purely an academic justification for studying them. I'm not trying to persuade anybody of anything. Gerald, is your hand still up?
Don't think so,
Oh,
but I still get to this written in the hearts of man. That means it is what I think it is. I mean,
I was,
you're really you have your standard is I feel that way, and therefore that's how man thinks.
well, it's not, it's the Catholic version of Plato's doctrine of recollection. It's like there's
Yeah.
something in me that tells me this is beautiful or this is wrong. Uh,
Hmm.
and uh, most of us, I think, would agree to that, that we have an internal feeling that can be really strong that something is unjust. And where do we get that? Well, he says we get it from the eternal law of God that's in our hearts. And Plato says it's something called the doctrine of recollection that we get from someplace he's not really sure of. But the fact is, I mean, the in defense of both Aquinas and Plato, we really don't know. We don't have a good explanation for why we have ethics.
Yeah, it still comes back to me to say it is. This is what it is because it's what I think it is. It's written in the hearts. It came from recollection. It came from wherever. But in fact, it just comes back. Well, how do you know what they are? Well, I know what they are because that's what I feel.
Well, the only thing I would add to that, though, is that with both Aquinas and Plato, they'd have to be consistent. You couldn't just say, well, today I thought it was right and tomorrow I don't. Or it's right for me, but it's not right for somebody else.
Hmm.
I think they would hold you to that level of logic, whereas just what you feel today or on any given day
Okay.
wouldn't be held to that standard. I think a couple other people, Peter.
Couple of things. One favorable to natural law and one critical of it. Like a lot of people, I will use the word natural in a positive sense without even thinking about it sometimes, and unnatural occasionally, though cautiously in a negative sense. So to take a pretty innocuous example, eating an ear of corn on the cob is natural in a way that eating something with a lot of high fructose corn syrup in it isn't, although obviously both of them are part of the natural world. But I think one big problem with natural law, besides one that a lot of people have touched on already, and that is that you tend to make your own prejudices and beliefs into natural law, whether or not they have anything to do with it. Some critic of Aquinas, I wish I remembered his name, but I've always remembered the sentence. After discussing natural law and saying it more or less assumes that nature is teleological, that nature has purposes, and that natural law, as expounded by Thomas Aquinas, conforms to those purposes, he says, let nature look to her own purposes if she has any. We will look to ours. And that's
Okay,
a very reasonable response, at that level.
Peter, I don't know what that quote comes from, but in philosophy, we call this the naturalistic fallacy. That is, that if nature does it, it's right. And this is considered a fallacy in logic. Uh, you know, people are naturally warlike, so are animals, so war is natural, so it's okay. I could give other examples, but well, you could say people excuse me, humans in nature are omnivores, and so vegetarianism is stupid. That would be another example of using the what they call a naturalistic fallacy. And in fact, we're going to find out with Hume that we don't have any idea where our values come from. Doug, I keep saying
Just
Dennis.
just a what was the sort of the status of the Bible and the theological documents that Aquinas was reading at that time? You know,
What do you
was it
mean? What?
was it in Greek? Was it all?
Oh, it would have been, he would have been reading it in Latin, I'm pretty sure, the Vulgate. But that's a good a good kind of in the weeds scholarly question. I'm pretty sure he would have read it in Latin, but I'm not positive of that. It's a good question. We could Google it. Uh, well, okay, we've gone past the hour. Anybody else got a urgent question that I can be ignorant about answering?
No, but it would be nice to come back to the natural law issue. If you're saying Hume is going to get to, we're going to see this come back again. That's sort of, because I see it in the founding fathers kind of view is there's all premised on the natural law or so clearly this is a very important through line that I'd like to hear more about as we go along.
It won't go away. Hume wrote a very famous book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which addresses a lot of this stuff, but she's got it, uh, which addresses a lot, but not all of this stuff. And yeah, it's not going to go away because there is not a good alternative to it in a way. We're going to be kind of touching on all the alternatives, and none of them are going to be satisfying. I would bet, but maybe they will be. I don't know. Uh, all right, guys. Next time we're going to. I guess we'll go with Hobbes next time. Hobbes or Descartes, one of those guys. Probably Hobbes, and uh, and we won't be monkeying around with any kind of supernatural or doctrines of recollection or anything like that. Hobbes is going to be a hardcore materialist, and we're not going to mess around with any fancy, stupid ideas like that anymore. Uh, so we'll get to him next time. Until then, be healthy and happy, and I'll see you then.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks,
Bye.
Tony.
All right.